So today I want to talk about the universality of sequences. That is, I want to show that sequences are a phenomenon that exists throughout existence. And of course, this is again part of my Patthana series. So the word sequences is my personal translation of the Pali term Samanantara Paccaya, which more literally would mean something like something occurring one after another. So I have already given in past talks my reasons why I changed some of the traditional translations of the Patthana condition, so I don't want to go into that again. But I recommend anyone listening to this talk to also, perhaps even before, listen to my talks about the basics of Buddhist philosophy and the Patthana conditions. But in either case, I try my best to make this a talk that can stand by itself. So, but as with all the previous Patthana conditions, I again will try to relate this condition of sequences to the four ultimates of Buddhist philosophy, which are matter, mind, consciousness, and Nibbāna. So let me begin with matter. Now, in all cosmologies, whether religious or scientific, the universe always is depicted as having come into being in stages. So it does not just pop out of nothingness. Or if it pops out of nothingness, then what pops out of nothingness is something different from what we have now as a universe. So there might be questions as to how the universe looked like in the beginning stages of its existence. But it is universally accepted or conceived of that the universe at some point in the past looked different from how it looks now. So, and this process that the universe took from its beginning stages until now, and the steps that it will take further into the future, now this is a sequence. So this is maybe the first, we can say, fundamental sequence that exists in matter, in the material universe. Then entering a slightly smaller scale, for example, looking at one planet like our Earth, we find that there are many sequences occurring even in the raw matter of the Earth. So, for example, the phenomenon of weather can be broken down into different stages, and then it will visibly be a sequence of things. For example, the first stage we could determine would be the water of the surface of the Earth gets vaporized by the sun, by the heat of the sun. And being vaporized, it moves into the atmosphere, and it moves upwards. And there it accumulates as clouds. And when the clouds become heavier and more dense, then the water falls down again and spreads evenly, more or less, over the surface of the Earth. So this is another sequence. And if we look around us, everywhere exists sequences. So if you want to have a look more closely into human life, for example, the human life begins either with conception or when a baby comes out of the mother's womb. Then the infant grows into a child. Then the child grows into youth. The youth grows into a middle-aged man or woman. And further along the line starts to slowly decline in vitality and youth, moving towards old age until death. So this is a natural sequence Now, you cannot change the order. It's a fixed order. And that shows us that there's a kind of order in the universe. And this, of course, also can help us in meditation. Because in meditation, we become aware of our body and the inside of our body. And certain things that occur in our body are fixed sequences. After you have eaten, if you meditate, for example, after your meal, then first the food gets broken down, then the sugar or the carbohydrates or the nutriment enter your bloodstream. These give energy to the different organs of your body, including your brain, including your heart, which again will give some vitality in turn also to your mind. So your heart gets activated and you become aware of ever stronger emotions. Your brain becomes activated and you become aware that you can just observe the emotions. Now, these are all things that occur in a certain sequence. And if you understand the sequence, then you can kind of calculate what would be the next link or occurrence in the sequence. So it can help you in a way to predict the future to some extent. And it can help you, if you have a certain aim in the future, it can help you to determine what kind of stages will have to occur before you reach that goal that you want to reach. So these are just some considerations of sequences in relation to matter. Then we can go on to the mind and show that the same thing applies in relation to the mind. So I've explained already in a previous talk that there's a sequence for the emergence and development of mental phenomena. So, for example, the first most basic condition of the mind is a condition of the mind in deep sleep. So there's not much consciousness, there's not much mental activity. It's just, as far as subjective experience goes, blank nothingness. But then out of this, slowly the mind begins vibrating and consciousness emerges. And that will be the condition in dreams, for example, when you're only a little bit conscious here and there, but there's all sorts of mental activity happening. This again at some point will calm down. The mental activity will calm down while consciousness keeps growing. And then the mind begins to turn outwardly. So at some point in the morning, for example, you hear the alarm clock or light hits your eyes or your eyelids and you slowly begin awakening. So you receive sense impressions, then you might begin to investigate these sense impressions. Then you determine, okay, it's that such and such o'clock in the morning. And then thinking begins. Okay, it's 7 o'clock in the morning, I have to go to work, I have to do this or do that. And then you develop some intentions which point towards the future. And then usually you have kind of small cycles going on wherein you receive another sense impression and again you investigate it, you again determine, okay, this means this. And you, based on that, you have another thought process and different intentions. So there is a very fixed sequence as to how mental phenomena occur. Then further, we have the condition of consciousness itself. Now, consciousness, as I've explained already in previous talks, is not just awareness, but our whole principle of individuality is included in the category of consciousness. This includes our nature of being, what we would usually call our character. And in that regard, I have already given a talk about the planes of existence that correspond to different conditions of consciousness or different conditions of being. So in Buddhist cosmology, each kind of state of consciousness corresponds to a certain plane of existence. So for example, if you're permanently depressed, if that's your kind of primary condition of being, or you're permanently drunk or drugged, this would, for example, in Buddhist cosmology correspond to a ghost realm existence. While going further down that road, if you're tormented continuously by guilt, now you have done something seriously wrong by your own standards, and you're continuously tormented by guilt, now this can lead you down the road to hell. While on the upper side, if you're capable of purifying your mind, you're living a selfless life, you're living a life that benefits others and yourself, then that corresponds cosmologically to the plane or level of being of the devas or angelic beings. And in Buddhist cosmology, you can go way higher. Now, if you're capable of mastering meditation, mastering the internal energies, then you can move up all the way to a kind of godlike existence, even to a kind of immaterial godlike existence. So, but the structure of the cosmology, the structure of the planes of existence, is an upward sequence. Now, it starts at the bottom, and there are gradations, there are stages, and these stages represent parts in a sequence. A vertical sequence, not a horizontal sequence. And the same applies with any kind of hierarchy. So a vertical sequence basically is a hierarchy, or a hierarchy basically is a vertical sequence. And the hierarchies exist not only on a cosmological level, but even in human society, or even amongst animals. Now, animals are usually classified according to complexity, according to skill and cognitive capacities of learning and social skills and so on. And based on this scheme, there can be seen a certain hierarchy, wherein very primitive and simple organisms like flatworms or sea stars now are at the bottom of the hierarchy, which would mean at the beginning of the sequence, while animals with more complex capacities like complex communication skills and cognitive abilities are at the upper end of the hierarchy, or at the further end of the sequence. And in human society, you also have hierarchies. Now you have the common worker, or people with disabilities or lack of skills, lack of cognitive capacities at the bottom. Then you have somewhere further up the line, the middle class families. Further up you have the high society. And in the ancient scheme, at the top of the list was a religious person. So that would then connect to the higher planes of the angelic beings and so on. So that much in regard to consciousness. Then we have another mental idea, or another mental condition, and that is the idea. And if we have a sequence of ideas, that is called logic. So logic means a sequence of ideas. So if a person proposes ideas, a chain of ideas, that is not a natural sequence, wherein one idea D follows directly an idea A, and there is no visible connection between the two. This is what we usually call lack of rationality, lack of logic. So this is just to show that in relation to ideas, the sequence also has a very predominant part, which in turn leads us to the last category of our scheme of the four ultimates, the four paramatta of Buddhist philosophy, which is Nibbāna. Now, Nibbāna itself stands for transcendence, which means transcendence of the phenomenal world, which includes sequences. So Nibbāna itself must be free of sequences. Nevertheless, even though Nibbāna is void of sequences, the path to Nibbāna is a definite sequence. And perhaps we can even say two sequences, one positive one and one negative one. So on the negative side, we can say that because the path to Nibbāna is the path to the overcoming or transcendence of matter, mind, and consciousness, we can say that there's a negative sequence going on there. So the negative sequence is the overcoming of matter, mind, and consciousness. Matter in the sense that we try to overcome our dependence on the material world, we try to overcome our dependence on our surroundings and our environment, and we try to overcome our dependence, in a sense, on our body, or an excessive attachment to our body. So that is what is meant by overcoming matter. Then with overcoming mind, I mean that we overcome our tendency to be overly attached and identified with whatever occurs in our mind. So on the path to Nibbāna, we try to overcome the tendency to be swung around by our moods. So we develop a certain detachment towards the mind and towards whatever arises in the mind. And that is kind of the negative aspect of the path in relation to mind. And then in relation to consciousness, we can say, as I said before, consciousness is not just mere awareness. Consciousness includes individuality. So it is our own individual way of perceiving the world that we are talking about when we are talking about consciousness. So, but when we develop the path to Nibbāna, we try to overcome our own limited worldview, our own limited way of looking at things. So we begin to look at things from different angles, and we try to overcome our certainty that the way we perceive the world is the only way the world can be perceived. This is what is meant with overcoming consciousness. It is overcoming our own personal, individual way of looking at the world. But then, as I've said, there's also a positive side to the path to Nibbāna. So we are not just overcoming matter, mind, and consciousness, but we also cultivate and develop certain things on the way. So, in order to master matter, or in order to master our environment, and in order to overcome the tendency to be overly attached to the body, we develop sila. We develop self-discipline, and we develop a stable way of responding to the world. So we limit ourselves in a way to only acting in certain ways, which makes us more predictable to other people and therefore also more trustworthy for other people, which overcomes many problems in the material world for ourselves and for others. So that is the positive side of the path in relation to matter. then in relation to mind, we also don't just overcome our tendency to be swung around by moods. No, we not only take good and bad mind states as equal, but we learn to first observe and then decide what is a weed we want to get rid of and what is a plant we want to grow. So we do not take the mind to be just an illusion and something that does not concern us, even though we try to develop detachment towards it, but we equally develop a discernment in regard to the mind, and we develop a certain skill of cultivating what we want in the mind, which is more lofty states of mind, greater calmness, greater benevolence, greater clarity and wisdom. Now these we cultivate, while when we come across things in our mind that we do not like to be there, then we try to overcome these. Then we try to pull out those weeds. So, and that relates to the practice of samadhi, the second part of the threefold scheme of the Buddhist path of enlightenment. First is sila, then samadhi. Third is wisdom. And this aspect we can say is more connected with consciousness. So we don't just think of the world as an illusion and as our individual consciousness as a delusion, but rather we find a way to look at the world in a way that is beneficial and in a way that helps us to grow spiritually within whatever confines we find ourselves in. And that requires a lot of wisdom, usually, because usually we don't find ourselves in the most ideal circumstances, and usually we are confined in many ways. So to look at the world in a way that helps us to develop is a wise way of looking at the world. And that relates to the third aspect of the Buddhist path of training, or the Buddhist path to Nibbāna, the practice of wisdom. So this is a kind of positive-negative dynamic in relation to the Buddhist path. So, and the Buddhist path is a sequence, and it is a sequence to Nibbāna. And that is basically all I can think about sequences at the moment. So now there's a sequence in relation to matter, especially the evolution of the universe and the sequences that occur in our bodies. Then there are sequences in relation to the mind. That is how the mind develops from a very unconscious condition to a condition basically of super consciousness, and from a condition of being deeply immersed in matter and in conflict with matter towards a condition that basically transcends matter and is able to dwell in a world of ideas. Then in relation to consciousness, we had specifically these hierarchies of existence, these hierarchies of being, these hierarchies of perceiving the world, from a perspective of earthworm, basically, to a perspective of a god. Now, there are many different ways of perceiving the world, and this can be expressed in a hierarchy, and as we have said before, a hierarchy is a vertical sequence. So that was about consciousness, and then about Nibbāna we described in a rough manner the stages of the path of virtue or sila, samadhi and panya. And I hope that sufficiently captured the importance of understanding sequences, so that we all can find our proper position in the sequences of existence, so that we understand with greater clarity what will be the next steps to take. And that may be a good conclusion for this talk.